paper draws on a more historical strand of my research in the last few years, which focuses on how minority activists have worked transnationally to try and promote greater acceptance of the NTA principle at the international level. And the focus is going to be on the European Nationalities Congress. If you don't know about it, it was established in Geneva in 1925 and it existed formally until 1938. It was a transnational umbrella organisation that brought together around 200 representatives of 20 national minorities from 15 European states in the period. It has to be said though that German minorities were always the largest and most influential group within ENC, and ENC itself grew out of a pre-existing organisation, the Verband der Deutschen Minderheiten in Europa, which was established in 1922. The ENC was heavily dependent on the Verband, which in turn received subsidies from Germany, and so obviously after 1933 this had fatal consequences. The Nazi government was able to exert growing control over the movement and it lost any remaining semblance of being an independent, genuinely transnational coalition of minority actors. Over the years that followed, essentially it became an instrument of Nazi German foreign policy. And if you look at what's been written around this, then most existing accounts would tend to start with the developments of the 1930s and work backwards. So the standard interpretation long became that the Verband and the ENC from the very outset were never more than a kind of Trojan horse for a revisionist Germany that was seeking to undermine the League of Nations and the post-World War I territorial settlements. My argument is that this existing literature misrepresents fundamentally the founding goals of ENC and the individuals who were most influential in shaping it during the late 1920s. And as I'll argue, some of these individuals have become important contributors to the theory of NTA. And they anticipated developments, in theoretical developments that only came to light, decades later. And moreover, the research I've done suggests that the ENC's founders weren't in opposition to the League. They aspired to work with and through the League framework to develop generalised principles of minority protection in the interests of a durable peace and a united Europe. And so here, previous studies have often overlooked the close coordination that existed between the ENC and other non-minority organisations within what you could call international civil society, the Union of League of Nations Societies, the International Law Organisation, also the Interparliamentary Union. There were very close ties at that time. And also, as I'll argue in the paper, the work of ENC also attracted significant expressions of interest, also solidarity from League officials, most notably those working within the minority section of the League Secretariat. Ultimately though, and this I suppose is the crux of the paper, the ENC and the League remained very far apart in terms of their visions of statehood. Moreover, what scope for cooperation that did exist was undermined by the problematic structures of the League itself, but perhaps more importantly by the deficiencies of the peace settlement and the very unstable, precarious international situation to which that gave rise. And so what I would say is that both the formation of both the Verband and later the ENC were essentially a response to peace settlements that had tried yet failed to address claims for national self-determination that had arisen so forcefully in Central and Eastern Europe during the course of World War I. And there's a famous quote from Woodrow Wilson at the end of 1918 where he said, "Self-determination is not a mere phrase, it's an imperative principle of action. This war had its roots in the disregard of the rights of small nations and nationalities which lacked the force to make good their claim to determine their own allegiances and their own forms of political life." As those who were charged with implementing the peace settlement on the ground would soon find out, actually delineating what Wilson called the small nations and nationalities of Central and Eastern Europe turned out to be far from evident in practice. However, insofar as these 14 points had made it necessary to do this, then how should own form of political life be defined? And basically, in the context of the peace settlements, national self-determination became entwined with the concept of the modern nation state, which implied in the context of Central and Eastern Europe that each ethno-culturally defined nation should have a sovereign state of its own. Now, as we know from earlier discussions, applying this model was always going to be impossibly difficult given the complex settlement patterns that existed within the region. What compounded things was that considerations of realpolitik at the peace conference meant that in many cases there wasn't even a real attempt to achieve the closest possible fit. And so all of these successor states to emerge from the former empires in the region contained significant national minority populations. At best, these were resented by the ruling majority elites as an obstacle to realizing more complete nation states. At worst, they were framed as an active threat to the very sovereignty and integrity of the state. And obviously, fears of irredentism were heightened in those instances where the minority in question was a majority in a neighbouring country, especially if that country harboured revisionist aims. And so the peacemakers sought to address the resultant shortcomings and tensions by obliging the successor states to sign minority treaties to be overseen by the minority protection system, so-called, of the League. But the deficiencies of these arrangements have been well documented, and the treaties themselves, first of all, were based on the precepts, I would say, of the unitary liberal democratic nation state. They envisaged, to go back to the keynote this morning, they envisaged a single undifferentiated political community of individual citizens. Within this framework, persons professing belonging to minorities were first and foremost supposed to be guaranteed freedom from discrimination on grounds of their ethnicity, and beyond this they were supposed to be given certain guarantees relating to the preservation of their distinct identities, such as the right to state-funded primary education in the mother tongue. What the peace treaties didn't make any provision for were collective minority rights in the form of autonomous institutions of minority self-government that would somehow sit between the centralised state and individual citizens. And as for the petition system which the League instigated as the basis of minority protection, this has been neatly summed up by one author as essentially a political procedure in which the sovereignty of the states was scrupulously respected and safeguarded, and only, I think, less than 5% of petitions actually made it through to a full discussion of the League Council. If they did, the state in question could exercise a veto. And so within this, representatives of minority populations themselves were given no direct voice in decision-making processes relating to their status and their interests. They were, I would say, entities that were to be protected by states and mostly in the interests of states. And behind this, you get this securitized vision of minorities, that they were somehow an anomaly in an idealized world of nation states. Minority political mobilization was seen as an unwelcome potential threat to the territorial status quo. And there's a good quote I found in the League of Nations archives that exemplifies this, from Sir Eric Drummond, who, when he heard the news of the first European Nationalities Congress in 1925, said that a meeting of this kind shows that the minorities who come do not appreciate their obligations of loyalty towards their new countries. This, I think, disregards fundamentally the ideas that drove both the Verband and the Nationalities Congress during its early stages. And I want to talk now about the person who was the guiding light of both organisations during their early phases, the German-Latvian Dr. Paul Schimann, who was among the core group that set up the Nationalities Congress, and who Josip Vilfan, who was the Slovene-Italian president of the Nationalities Congress, would later call the thinker of the European minorities movement. And there's a very nice quote here from Schimann, which is the perfect counterpoint to Drummond, Sheeman famously said that politics entails work for the good of the place one inhabits. Any diversion to other ends is suicide. And what I would say is that Sheeman was, at the time, the prime exemplar of a genuine minority politics, which shaped the founding resolutions of the ANC and its work until 1932. And he, his vision was basically, when he used the phrase a national state, by which he meant a state as a shared territorial space inhabited by different ethnic and national groups. And when I talk about Sheeman as an exemplar of minority politics, I would say that for him, the interest of the particular cultural community of the minority was obviously very important, but it was ultimately secondary to those of the larger state community within which different groups live together, and that quote, I think, exemplifies that. And so what were the principles that Sheeman brought to the Nationalities Congress during its formative period? First was a rejection of irredentism. There would be no changes to territorial borders, but different actors had to work within them to come up with a more pluralistic set of arrangements. And any minority organisation that came to ANC had to explicitly pledge loyalty to the state community of which it formed part. Sheeman also, and the Congress, they welcomed the fact that minority rights had been made a matter of international law, but they saw the first priority as being to create institutional mechanisms for majority-minority relations within states that would render international intervention unnecessary. So they were starting at the state level and working outwards. But when it came to the international level, the emphasis was on general principles that would improve the lot of all minorities, and trying to get those principles accepted and worked upon at the national level. And here I would say that the Congress in its initial incarnation was very much a transnational coalition. It was committed to improving the lot of all minorities. And while, as I've said, German groups were predominant within it, the main axis of cooperation was with Jewish minority representatives from the region at that time. They formed the nucleus and shaped the principles. ENC's founders in this respect welcomed the League of Nations engagement to address minority issues, and they declared a firm will to contribute as far as possible to its achievement of that goal. And again, another quote there, the Congress, this is in the words of Wilfan, who I mentioned, and Ewald Amender, the secretary, in 1933, they said the Congress does not envisage sweeping away the foundations in place, but rather seeks to increase the sturdiness of the existing edifice on a platform that's much bigger, better cemented, and designed to satisfy everyone. And so in this respect, the Congress argued for the need to improve existing procedures which de facto were doing nothing to reverse nationalising state pressures to assimilate or exclude minorities. It called upon the League Council to first establish a permanent minorities commission at the League to replace the existing petition system. Secondly, to adopt generalised pan-European guarantees of minority rights that would be applicable to all states in place of a treaty system confined specifically to Central and Eastern Europe, and which led inevitably to accusations of double standards, undermining the credibility of the League. And thirdly, the guarantees had to be based on the principle of minority self-governance in the areas of language and culture. And here we get to the crux of the argument around NTA, because Sheeman and the other founders were deeply inspired by Renner and Bauer's concept of non-territorial autonomy. They defined nations, national groups, as communities of persons constituted on the basis of individual free choice and affiliation, and having the right to elect institutions of cultural self-government, irrespective of where the participating members lived within a state. And so they were essentially trying to break that conceptual link between ethnicity and claims to ownership of territory. It's notable also, though, that in the founding declarations of the ANC, both the obligation and the right, it was couched in both terms, to learn the dominant language of the state was impressed in order to enable full participation in political life. And so in making the case for NTA, the ENC's leaders cited the example of Estonia. We've heard about it earlier today in passing, but Estonia was unique in interwar Central and Eastern Europe in adopting a minority law based on NTA principles. This was passed in 1925, and subsequent implementation of this law by the German and Jewish minorities in Estonia during the late 20s had, it was generally agreed, dispelled previous fears voiced that this would create a state within a state, that it would undermine the sovereignty of the country, it would destabilise it, and so on. The general view was that relations had improved. Not all issues had been resolved, but things had improved. And so this was the case that ENC's leaders took to the League, asking that it support a more generalised application of this principle at the European level. And as a final principle that was voiced during this time, ENC said that minorities should be free to interact with external kin states where such states existed, but such interaction should be purely cultural, not political. And again, the argument was made that political interference, engagement by a kin state, was more likely if the state of residence did not take steps to protect its own minorities. So basically what we see is an attempt to promote minorities as agents in their own right, and to replace what Sheeman and others saw as a more limited concept of minority protection with a genuine conception of minority rights that would make minorities subjects, not objects, of international law. That was Sheeman's quote. So how did the League respond? Well, I've got a long quote for you there from Ludwig de Krabbe, who was one of the representatives of the minority section, and it shows a certain sympathy, a certain admiration for the Congress, which de Krabbe said could create a place and an authority among the organisations working to develop international society. At the same time, it's important to note both his wariness and a more general wariness on the part of the League when it came to any notion of supporting collective rights to minority autonomy. And here the crux is from Krabbe's response into the ENC's NTA proposal in 1931, where he said that the complete solution to the minorities problem remains the development in countries of mixed population of a spirit of national tolerance and liberalism, a development which will become all the more difficult if a system of separatism in certain branches of the state becomes generalised. Now, Krabbe, in his response, he does make some very perceptive and valid criticisms of the Nationalities Congress and its programme. But more broadly, what we see is a continued attachment to the liberal unitary nation state model, and a long-term aim which can probably be summed up by the quote from Austin Chamberlain in 1925, the British Foreign Minister, when he said the objective of the treaties was to secure for minorities that measure of protection that would gradually prepare them to be merged into the national community to which they belonged. Now, this continued attachment to this vision overlooked the fact that this nation-state model was plainly not working in a Central and East European context. And it also overlooked the obvious deficiencies of the League to rectify this. I go back to a quote by Sir Willoughby Dickinson in November 1921, who prepared a report on the conditions of national minorities in the region, and he said that minorities are not disloyal to their new states, but they will become so if they continue to be unfairly treated. This calls for immediate attention on the part of the League. By 1932, Krabbe himself was admitting that, or observing that, the procedures of the League were becoming an increasing source of frustration for minority leaders within ENC, and as I said at the beginning, this meant that certain groups, especially the German, were becoming up for grabs, you could say, by kin states. They were starting to look outwards to kin states as guarantors of their interests rather than looking to the international system. Just to conclude, I mean, is it unreasonable to say that the Secretariat could have done more? You know, when you look at the nature of the League structures, when you look above all at the unstable European environment that existed at the time, perhaps not. Perhaps it is unreasonable, I should say. But just to flip forward, I mean, if you go to the post-war context, and particularly the post-Cold War context, you can say that the international order has appeared far more propitious to minority rights protection than it did between the two world wars, obviously. And yet, at the same time, you can maybe ask the question, to what extent has the international order moved beyond the state-centric, you know, it's an essentially state-centric character. And here, just to conclude, I want to flag up the continued existence of FWEN from the late 1940s, and particularly the Minority Safe Pack initiative, which was a successful citizens' initiative that will oblige the European Commission to discuss more far-reaching measures. So it shows that, you know, these issues remain ongoing, and there's a certain continuity over the past 100 years, and I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. This is the first question to you. Sorry to take the advantage of being chairman. Do we have representatives of minorities that are coming from minorities under the legal framework of protection, mostly, or most of the minorities that are outside the legal protection of the League of Nations?
I think what is very important is the name per se. It's not the Minority Protection Institution, it's the Congress of European Nationalities, and I think this brings us back to what we briefly discussed before. Nobody wants to be a minority, so they claim to be a nationality because I think and that's the fundamental difference between the League of Nations and the Congress. The League of Nations thought and considered the nation state to be the ideal ordering system of Europe or of the world, whereas the Congress considered nationality or the national group as to be the basic element of international order. And there also comes the idea what you mentioned, that Schuman proposes this idea of an national state, so a state that is there for its citizens and where national groups can do whatever they want, but the state in itself has no national color and only provides the legal framework for the nationalities that are living there to develop. And I think this links very nicely to Natalia's, basically you would only have indigenous groups.
I mean, predominantly they came from Central and Eastern Europe, but there were some from the western part of Europe, so there were Catalan representatives, for instance. What's interesting about FWEN that I mentioned at the end, that it was flipped. So obviously that was an organisation that grew up in the context of post-war European integration. So it was primarily Western European nationalities, minority nationalities, and then you know, it widened to the east after 1990. Can the League be held accountable? I mean, there are different schools of thought on that. I mean, some people say that if, you know, again, you're into counterfactuals. If you were in a different international environment, then the leak procedures might have worked given time. You know, this might have provided a, you know, an acceptable framework. I mean, when I was talking about this, I keep coming back to, if you've read Erin Jenner's recent book, Nested Security, that is a really good study where she compares the interwar period and the post-Cold War period and says that, you know, any multilateral system of norms can only be as effective as the, you know, the overarching geopolitical environment allows. And I think, obviously, my final comment, you know, the geopolitical situation was far more precarious between the wars. Hopefully it's not becoming so again as we speak, but, you know, until recently things have looked a whole lot more stable. I mean, the one thing I would say in relation to that is that I think the war, obviously World War II created this mistaken impression that minority rights had been part of the problem rather than part of the solution, given how, you know, minority issues had been manipulated by Nazi Germany during the 1930s, and that it took a while for that to, you know, for the principle to reassert itself. And the final, yeah, just a comment on your comment, Boris. I mean, I would agree entirely. I think nationalities as a basic element, yes. With Schuman, I think the state was also important, and I think, you know, it wasn't entirely state-free, if I can use that term, because that's one of the criticisms that's addressed to him. He says, well, what about, you know, it goes back to the kind of centripetalist argument that you can set up this notion of an a-national state inhabited by autonomous groups, but what brings them together? And Schuman did devote quite a lot of thought to that in his work. And I think that, to finish off, I think when he talks about an a-national state, he meant a state that was as culturally pluralistic as it could possibly be. And in that sense, he's anticipating, you know, a lot of developments in political theory, you know, in the later decades of the 20th century and the 21st.
It's a very apologetic approach to saying that these minority issues and these unstable states created the Second World War, because of course it made it easier for Hitler to mobilize opinion. It made it easier, when we think about the Munich agreements and these things, that it made it easier for Hitler to play the right of self-determination card. But from the very beginning, it was clear that the war was not about freeing the German minorities. This was about the expansion and, like, Nazi control over the whole of Central Europe until the Urals. So I think that is clear now.
Was there a? That's why I asked. Was there a fertile ground amongst Sudeten Germans, or that were? Oh, that could then be used by Hitler?
That's an important point. It was the Sudeten Germans came. They assumed the leadership of the Verband and the Nationalities Congress during the 1930s, and it's obvious that the people that I was talking about, like Schuman, they came from the Baltic states, where, you know, the German minorities there were in many ways a kind of perfect template for NTA. They were small, they were dispersed, and trying. That's when I said that Krabbe, he did actually do a point-by-point analysis and said, well, if you look around Europe, you can't. There's no basis to claim that all minorities are buying into NTA. Not even all the minorities in Estonia had bought into NTA. So, you know, and in that sense, he was pointing to more territorially concentrated groups, which was a factor for the German minorities, obviously. But also, and this picks up on a point talked about earlier, Krabbe said there were groups that didn't want NTA specifically because it would, you know, perhaps mark them out as a separate category. In a way they didn't. They prefer a more limited and more flexible set of arrangements. So, as I say, there are very valid criticisms that can be voiced at the Nationalities Congress, and it's an attempt to advocate some kind of one-size-fits-all approach. But they, you know, what they were concerned with was breaking that conceptual link between ethnicity and territory, I suppose.
Okay. It's a big discussion.
Thanks very much.